Busy White House. President Donald Trump responds to the riots around the country. He also addresses religious freedom. Call to protesters. America's top military officer tells us his message to those demonstrating over the death of George Floyd. Protecting the vulnerable. How the Vatican is helping in the fight against child sexual abuse during the coronavirus pandemic. And a special donation. Pope Francis delivers a way to help the homeless in Rome. We'll explain. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020. Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. President Donald Trump signs an executive order to promote international religious freedom. It comes just after he visited the St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, D.C. White House correspondent Owen Jensen, brings us the background on both. Owen?
Tracy, the president is bringing faith to the forefront. That executive order he signed at the White House is aimed at helping advance religious freedom across the globe.
President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania visit St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, a quiet moment of reflection under the bigger-than-life statue of one of the most popular Roman Catholic popes of all time. A shrine spokesman saying the visit was initially planned as the signing of an international religious freedom executive order and had been scheduled some time ago. The signing instead took place at the White House. It calls for at least $50 million per year for programs that advance international religious freedom, expands economic tools to support our allies on the issue, and more religious freedom training for federal employees who work overseas. Meantime, last night in the Rose Garden, the president remembering George Floyd.
All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd.
At the same time, promising a show of force to quell the riots.
I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
Here in the nation's capital, they've clearly beefed up security. Here at 17th in Pennsylvania, take a look behind me. That tall chain link fence was just installed. And right over here, buildings up and down the street, all boarded up.
In the same neighborhood, workers building up a protection wall, law enforcement shutting down this intersection. And speaking in Philadelphia, former Vice President Joe Biden looking himself to move into the Oval Office, ripped into the president.
Donald Trump has turned this country into a battlefield riven by old resentments and fresh fears. He thinks division helps him. His narcissism has become more important than the nation's well-being that he leads.
Now, Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington criticized President Trump's visit to the shrine, calling it, quote, reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated. His words. The shrine, for its part, says it welcomes all people to come and pray and learn more about John Paul II. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Thank you again, Owen. Our reactions vary to the president's visit. A pastor and civil rights leader says the John Paul II Shrine or any house of worship is hardly in a position to turn away anyone. Pastor Eugene Rivers III says it is a difficult situation, but the issue of religious freedom should transcend partisanship, and Christ himself often met with those that others disapproved of. Pastor Rivers says, quote, I don't see how a shrine or other house of worship can turn down a visit by anyone who wants to pay their respects or pray there, let alone the president. Those who call the president a sinner should remember that Jesus regularly caused scandal by eating and welcoming those who were seen as unpopular or inappropriate during his lifetime. Pastor Rivers also says that Jesus welcomes everyone, including President Trump. For more on this story, including a look at the president's visit to a church near the White House that was burned during rioting, go to CatholicNewsAgency.com. And coming up later in the show, we hear from Sam Brownback, U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi criticized the force used against a crowd of protesters late yesterday before President Trump walked from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church, which was damaged in weekend riots. Correspondent Eric Rosales reports now from Capitol Hill. Eric.
Well, Tracy, although Republicans saw it as a show of strength, Democratic leaders from both sides of the Capitol say that President Trump's actions last night were, quote, a political stunt. Now, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is zeroing in on it and is pushing for bold action.
The Department of Defense IG must immediately launch an investigation into how the U.S. military was used and whether it was consistent with the laws of our nation.
Criticism after police used tear gas last night to disperse crowds outside the White House, clearing the way for President Trump to walk to St. John's Episcopal Church. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff checked in on the D.C. National Guard.
Allow freedom to assemble and freedom of speech. That's perfectly fine. We support that. We took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States of America to do that and to protect everyone's rights, and that's what we do.
And while decrying violent protests, the Democratic leader expressed understanding.
Violence, wherever it occurs, is wrong. But not prosecuting law enforcement when they break the law with the same intensity as protesters when they break the law is wrong as well.
I asked protesters outside the Capitol yesterday, why use violence?
It's easy to say, oh, you don't want the violence to continue. Well, we tried it peacefully. So what is the other alternative?
Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham advises.
I would urge the protester and the police to work together. The looters are undercutting the protesters' cause. They're putting the police at risk. So it seems to be some common ground between the protester and the police to deal with a rioter.
Senator Graham says the Judiciary Committee will be holding a hearing about police misconduct June 16th, and members of the Congressional Black Caucus are working on legislation right now about police misconduct. Tracy?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill. Thanks so much, Eric. Well, as George Floyd's death fuels demonstrations nationwide, it is also sparking renewed conversations about race and racism in America. Joining me now on Skype is Reverend Dean Nelson, Executive Director of the Pro-Life Human Coalition Action. Reverend, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you.
Well, Reverend, I'd like to start off by getting your reaction to George Floyd's death. What went through your mind when you saw those images?
You know, my heart still goes out, particularly to his family, as well as to any of the people that have been involved with unjust, actions such as that. I was stunned. I was horrified. And to watch that video of George Floyd being killed without concluding that his death was both tragic and the result of an evil act is just unconscionable. Human Coalition has, for the last decade, worked to preserve and to serve those who are most vulnerable. And at the end of the day, this is really a lack of respect for the value of dignity of human life. And racism is, in fact, an assault against human dignity. And so we want to stand with those who are protesting peacefully and to say to America that this is a time that we really should be having open and honest conversations about race.
Yeah, definitely. Well, George Floyd's death has inspired discussions, that is, on race and racism in this country. And I know it's an uncomfortable topic for many to talk about, but unfortunately, it is a harsh reality. How do we address that in ways that everyone can understand?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we need to give each other a little bit of space to show each other some deference. I know that there's anger from a lot of folks. I have experienced that anger, but recognizing even from the scriptures of St. James that, the anger of man doesn't produce the righteousness of God. I believe that we should be having these conversations, whether it's fathers and mothers at dinner tables with their children. This morning, I was pleased to see police officers and clergy meeting together and praying together. These are meaningful discussions that should be had, and I think that we all, though, need to give each other just a little bit of grace and deference to be able to have these honest and sometimes painful discussions But my hope is that when we look at each other as humans, I believe that we ultimately can move forward in this struggle.
Reverend, can we talk about the protests that are going on right now around the country? I'd like to get your take on them. And I know that you've said that not all protesters should be painted with the same brush. What exactly did you mean by that?
Yeah, as an advocate for life and for justice, I believe that we should be encouraging people to protest, but to protest peacefully. Yesterday, my 3 children, we prayed over them before they went to Baltimore with their masks, socially distancing, protesting. But that is very, very different from some of the riotous looters who have little regard for life and property that have gone into some of these communities. Many of them outside agitators who have gone in and spray painted buildings, busted out glass, and even given bricks to young people. These are outside people who are trying to create havoc, and I believe that our communities are disserved by those type of, I wouldn't even call them protesters, but those type of agitators who are breaking the law and instigating anger at a time when our country is very vulnerable.
Well, Reverend, thank you so much for coming on today and taking the time to speak with us. We appreciate it. Reverend Dean Nelson, Executive Director of Human Coalition Action. Thank you again, Reverend.
Thank you, and God bless you.
The leader of Hong Kong is defending China's new security law and warns the U.S. to not impose sanctions or change the status of the former British colony.
My task and my stance is to point out to the American government and indeed to other governments, should that occasion arise, that they will be hurting their own interests in Hong Kong.
Carrie Lam, who is Catholic, is also comparing the protesters in Hong Kong to the riots in the United States. She says it is a double standard to condemn the heavy tactics of the Hong Kong police. Meanwhile, officials are extending the Hong Kong lockdown.
We are looking into and considering the different factors based on public health and not other considerations.
Officials claim the reason for extending the coronavirus restrictions has nothing to do with the protests. Social distancing rules were supposed to end this week. Yesterday, Hong Kong police rejected an application for protesters to hold the annual candlelight vigil marking the anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. The Associated Press has obtained phone calls of officials at the World Health Organization back in January who were frustrated at delays by China on releasing crucial information about COVID-19. And now some countries are calling for an investigation.
Yeah, we certainly welcome international review, but the purpose is not to label any country. All countries that closely covered by the virus should be accountable.
The Chinese ambassador to Britain also says any investigation into the origins of COVID-19 should be carried out by the World Health Organization. In Russia, the economy is reeling from a shutdown from the coronavirus pandemic and a plummet in oil prices. President Vladimir Putin is telling his prime minister by video conference to take quick steps to bolster the Russian economy. The recovery plan, costing $73 billion, would stimulate economic growth with housing construction, improving education, and investing in digital technologies. The president of Italy lays a wreath to honor the victims of the coronavirus pandemic. President Sergio Mattarella visited a cemetery earlier today. It is in the Lombardy region, where Italy's first case of COVID-19 was confirmed. The area was declared a red zone at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic back in February. Coming up, we talk to Ambassador Sam Brownback about President Donald Trump's executive order on religious freedom. Today's signing by President Trump of an executive order on international religious freedom advances his previous call for other countries to end religious persecution, integrating that call into U.S. foreign policy. U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, joins me now from the White House to talk more about today's executive order. Ambassador, welcome back to the show, and thank you for your time.
Hey, happy to join you, Tracy, and excited about this executive order that the President signed. I think it can be really useful in this push for international religious freedom.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time today and talking about it. Today's action budgets at least $50 million per year for programs that advance international religious freedom. Can you talk a little bit more about those programs and exactly how they will support this very important cause?
You know, if the $50 million is an increase from what we currently are we're using on this, but the real crux of the program that he's done is that he's now within the next 180 days, there has to be a plan developed about how to integrate international religious freedom into all the parts and the tentacles of State Department, USAID. And so what you're really seeing taking place now is religious freedom, international religious freedom, going into all the various aspects of foreign policy, of statecraft. So that's a fabulous move. The increase in the funding will be helpful, I think, in programming. And the programming is in a lot of different areas. A lot of times it's targeted where we've got a particular religious freedom problem and a nation that's willing to address it. Often you have religious freedom issues and the country's not willing to address it. And there really the money is not of much use to you. You're really looking more at a sanctions type issue in that situation.
Well, Ambassador, back in 2019, President Trump made history as the first American president to convene a meeting of global leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in order to address international religious freedom. How does today's order help the U.S. to support countries that are doing the right thing and also address those who aren't?
Well, this builds on what the President did at the UN General Assembly, which really was groundbreaking. I mean, nobody else had ever done that. The UN Secretary General was there, made a good, strong, positive statement. And for years, the issue of religious freedom has kind of been a backwater type of issue, unfortunately. And because of that, then you've seen this level of persecution grow around the world. You've seen 80% of the world's population live in a religiously restricted atmosphere. So the President's really put his mark on this one and say this is a foundational human right. We're going to push on it. And today's executive order builds on that. This is the first time we've ever had an executive order on international religious freedom. And it's the first time we've really had a mandate and had it from the President to now bleed this issue into all the aspects of statecraft and to do it as a whole of government approach. So it's also going to be in our development aid programs too and other programs across the U.S. government that have a foreign reach to them. So this is a big issue, and it really builds on what the President did at the UN.
Yeah, and I also understand that today's action also mandates that more federal employees who work abroad undergo training on international religious freedom. Can you talk about that and the significance of that? And do you think this was important to include?
Well, I think it's very important to include. And the reason I think it's very important to include is that when we have people assigned overseas, they've got a whole array of topics that they're representing the United States government on. But what this says is now we want you to be particularly trained in these religious freedom issues because they're of importance to us on a basic building block of human rights. And so this training, I think, will then put more front of mind nature for our people that are representing us overseas to be able to see things, to be able to say, okay, this is an issue, we need to be addressing it more. This is, again, one of those things where, you know, as you know more, you learn more, you see more. And that's what I think this training will be beneficial for.
Well, Ambassador, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the lockdowns due to the pandemic, maybe how they have restricted religious freedom.
We've seen two things. They've been in opposite trends. One, we have seen the release of a number of religious prisoners around the world, and that's a good thing, and it needs to continue. In the bad category, what we've seen is a persecution of people of religious minorities in a number of countries where in cases they haven't been able to get the humanitarian aid or the health care that they need during the pandemic. pandemic. And we've been pushing a lot of the countries around the world saying, you know, please treat them as equal citizens, not better, not worse than anybody else. So we have seen a lot of reaction, really, to the coronavirus that has had direct impact on the religious minority communities. We're stepping up more in our alliance efforts with other nations, 29 other nations on religious freedom, and that's worked during the pandemic. But we've got a long ways to go for religious freedom.
Absolutely. Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time and all that you do. We appreciate you taking time out to speak with us today. U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, thank you again.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next, an update on the Vatican's effort to protect children. And Pope Francis donates an ambulance dedicated to help one group of people. We'll explain. The deadly coronavirus is not stopping the fight against child sexual abuse. The Vatican Center for Child Protection is helping in an online initiative. Web seminars allow experts to discuss protecting children and vulnerable adults during and after the pandemic. Father Han Zoeller, member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and president of the Center for Child Protection, joins us now from Munich. Father, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Father, tell us about these online discussions. Who will participate and what has been the response so far?
Now, we have had the idea that we should offer webinars, especially in this difficult situation for most people on the planet, with the virus pandemic and all people somehow affected by it. And we wanted to show that safeguarding work is going on and needs to go on. And we offered a first webinar from a victim's perspective on how can we deal with this situation worldwide. We asked experts to share their best practices, and we were really flashed with the turnout. We had more than 600 participants enrolled. So this was very encouraging, safeguarding personnel from more than 70 countries.
Father, can you talk about how this pandemic may be impacting victims of sexual abuse?
Now, victims of sexual abuse who have suffered grievously in the past may be reminded by the situation that they are locked inside the house, locked inside a certain room, a certain situation. They may be triggered in the sense that the flashbacks from their own past wounds come back from their very terrible experiences. And so this is one aspect that is very painful for many victims of abuse. The second aspect is that somehow the perception is that they are cut off from social agencies, from church institutions, from state agencies that could intervene. Because it is not easy to contact people if you don't know to whom to turn to, if your regular contacts are shut down. So this is another very difficult aspect for many victims of abuse.
Yeah, very, very difficult situation there. I know it's been a little over a year since the Vatican Sexual Abuse Summit. Has there been any progress, and what do you think still needs to happen?
Now, we have seen a lot of progress since the summit in February 2019. We have had a number of new laws. The most important law considers what is called the accountability, so that bishops and provincials who do not act according to church law, that they have to be reported now, and that there's a procedure how they can really be taken to responsibility. Another law that is important, especially also in this moment, is that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, issued a new law concerning what is called child sexual exploitation material online, and raised the age from 14 to 18 for all that material that is punishable in dissemination and in production. We have also seen that bishops' conferences need to include the new Indian guidelines, the new legislation, unfortunately, of course, many bishops' conferences, many religious congregations are taken up by all kinds of emergency situations now, and I don't see that this is going to go forward in the time that was foreseen, but I do hope that we can come back to that with the same rigor and the same energy and the same commitment as before.
Oh, Father, thank you so much for your time today and for all that you do. Father Han Zoeller, member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and president of the Center for Child Protection.
Thank you, Tracy.
Oh, finally tonight, Pope Francis makes a donation to the city of Rome. On Sunday, the Holy Father gave the city a special ambulance. It will be used to care for the underprivileged and homeless. The vehicle belongs to the Vatican's fleet, has Holy See license plates, and was blessed by Pope Francis. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.